The autumn wind rattled the ancient windows of Ravenshollow Castle as King Edward stood alone in his private chambers. 53 years of life had carved deep lines around his eyes, and 30 years of marriage had taught him the bitter taste of silence. Outside, the kingdom of Eldoria thrived under his rule, but inside these walls, his heart withered like the dying leaves in the courtyard below. Queen Isabella had not spoken to him in 3 days. Not since the argument about Princess Margaret's marriage proposal. The French Duke was a good match, politically sound, financially beneficial for the kingdom. But Margaret was only 17, the same age Isabella had been when she married Edward. He remembered the fear in his young bride's eyes on their wedding day, how she trembled when he took her hand at the altar. Edward picked up the letter from his desk, reading it for the 100th time. The royal physician's words were clear and final. The weakness in his chest, the breathlessness that came more frequently now, the strange numbness in his left arm, all pointed to the same conclusion. His heart was failing, and time was running short. Perhaps months, maybe a year if he was fortunate. The irony wasn't lost on him. His physical heart was dying just as surely as his emotional one had died years ago. Isabella had once looked at him with something that might have been love, or at least hope. Now she looked through him as if he were a ghost already haunting these halls. Their marriage had been arranged, of course. Royal marriages always were. But, in the beginning, they had tried to make it work. Isabella was intelligent, beautiful, and kind to the servants. She performed her duties as queen flawlessly, bore him 3 children, and stood by his side at countless state functions. Yet somewhere along the way, duty had replaced affection, and routine had strangled any chance of genuine connection. Edward walked to the window and watched Isabella in the garden below. Even at 45, she moved with the grace of a dancer. Her dark hair was pulled back in an elegant bun, and she wore the blue dress he had given her for her birthday. The birthday where she had thanked him politely and set the gift aside without truly looking at it. She was directing the gardeners to prepare the roses for winter, her voice carrying faintly on the wind. Isabella had always loved the gardens. In their early years together, she would sometimes invite him to walk with her among the flowers. They would talk about small things, the weather, the children's lessons, plans for the harvest festival. Simple conversations that felt precious now in their absence. When had she stopped asking him to join her? When had he stopped accepting when she did? The erosion had been so gradual that he couldn't pinpoint the moment their marriage shifted from hopeful cooperation to polite coexistence. The children had helped bridge the gap for a while. Prince William, now 28, and commanding his own regiment. Princess Catherine, 25, and married to the Duke of Westmore. And Margaret, their youngest at 17, still living at home, but eager to spread her wings. When they were small, family dinners had been filled with laughter and stories. Isabella would catch Edward's eye across the table, and they would share the secret smiles of parents watching their children grow. But children grow up and leave. And when the last buffer between them had diminished, Edward and Isabella found themselves alone together, strangers who shared a bed and a crown but little else. He turned from the window and sat heavily in his leather chair. The physician had asked if he wanted to tell Isabella about his condition. Edward had said he would consider it, but what was there to consider? Would the knowledge that he was dying bring her back to him, or would it simply be another duty for her to bear? The burden of nursing a husband she no longer loved through his final days? The door opened quietly, and his valet, Thomas, entered with the evening's correspondence. Thomas had served the royal family for 20 years and had watched the slow dissolution of his master's marriage with the discretion of a professional and the sadness of someone who genuinely cared. "Your Majesty," Thomas said softly, setting the letters on the desk. "Will you be dining with the Queen tonight?" Edward almost laughed. When was the last time he and Isabella had dined alone together? Months, perhaps longer. Their meals were either formal state dinners with dignitaries or family gatherings when the children visited. Never just the two of them, sitting across from each other with nothing but silence and the soft clink of silverware. "No, Thomas. I'll take dinner here." Thomas nodded, expecting this answer. As he turned to leave, Edward called out to him, "Thomas, do you remember the Queen's wedding dress?" The older man paused, his eyes growing distant. "Indeed, Your Majesty. Ivory silk with pearl embroidery. She looked like an angel that day." "She was so young," Edward murmured. "So frightened." "If I may say so, Your Majesty, you both were. 18 and 17, carrying the weight of a kingdom on your shoulders." After Thomas left, Edward sat alone with his thoughts, and the ticking of the ancient clock on the mantel. Somewhere in this vast castle, Isabella was probably reading in her sitting room, or perhaps writing letters to Catherine. They lived parallel lives under the same roof, like actors who had forgotten they were supposed to be playing opposite each other. The physician's letter crinkled in his hand as he folded it carefully and placed it in the locked drawer of his desk. Tomorrow he would have to make decisions about the succession, about Margaret's future, about the kingdom's welfare after his death. But, tonight, he would simply sit in his chair and remember a time when the possibility of love had existed between them, even if it had never fully bloomed. Queen Isabella closed her book and set it gently on the small table beside her chair. The fire in her private sitting room crackled softly, casting dancing shadows on the walls lined with portraits of long-dead royals who seemed to watch her with knowing eyes. She had been trying to read the same page for the past hour, but the words blurred together like watercolors in rain. Margaret had come to her that afternoon, tears streaming down her young face, begging not to be sent away to France. The girl was in love with Sir James, one of the young knights in the castle guard. It was a foolish, impossible love, but Isabella remembered that feeling, the way your heart could race at a simple glance, the way hope could make even the darkest day feel bright. She had been gentle with Margaret, explaining the realities of royal duty, the importance of advantageous marriages, the way personal desires must sometimes be set aside for the greater good. Even as she spoke the words, they felt like ashes in her mouth. How could she counsel her daughter about duty when her own dutiful marriage had become such a hollow shell? Isabella rose and walked to her window, which faced the east wing where Edward's chambers were located. A soft light glowed behind his curtains. Was he reading late into the night again, working on affairs of state? Sometimes she would see him walking alone in the early morning hours, as if sleep had abandoned him entirely. There had been a time when she would have gone to him if she noticed he was troubled. Early in their marriage, when they were still trying to build something real between them, she would knock softly on his door and ask if he needed anything. Sometimes he would invite her in, and they would sit together in comfortable silence while he worked. She would read or embroider, and occasionally he would share something about the challenges of ruling, seeking her counsel on matters of diplomacy or domestic policy. Isabella had been well educated for a woman of her time. Her father had insisted she learn languages, history, and statecraft alongside music and needlework. Edward had seemed to appreciate her intelligence in those early days, asking for her opinions on trade agreements and territorial disputes. She had felt useful then, valued for more than just her ability to produce heirs and look presentable at state functions. When had that changed? When had Edward stopped seeking her advice, stopped sharing his burdens with her? Perhaps it was after Prince William's difficult birth, when she had been confined to bed for months and Edward had learned to handle everything alone. Or maybe it was during the border conflicts with Scotland, when military matters consumed his attention and she felt increasingly irrelevant to the serious business of ruling. The distance had grown so gradually that neither of them had noticed until it became a chasm too wide to bridge. Now they were polite strangers, sharing ceremonial duties, but nothing of their inner lives. Isabella knew Edward's schedule, his public concerns, his official obligations. But she had no idea what he thought about when he stared out his window in the early morning hours, or what made him smile anymore. A soft knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. "Come in," she called, expecting her lady's maid with the evening's warm milk. Instead, Margaret entered, her eyes red-rimmed, but determined. "Mother, I need to ask you something." Isabella gestured to the chair across from her own. "Of course, darling. Sit down." Margaret perched on the edge of the chair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Were you ever in love with father?" The question hit Isabella like a physical blow. She stared at her daughter's earnest face, seeing her own younger self reflected there. The same dark eyes, the same stubborn chin, the same desperate hope that love might somehow triumph over duty. "That's a very personal question, Margaret." "I know, but I need to understand. When you married him, did you feel anything? Or was it always just duty?" Isabella looked into the fire, watching the flames consume the carefully arranged logs. How could she explain the complexity of arranged marriage to someone who had never experienced it? The strange mixture of hope and resignation. The way you could convince yourself that respect might grow into affection, that shared purpose might bloom into love. "Your father was kind to me," she said finally. "He was young too, remember? Only 18 when we married. We were both frightened children trying to play adult roles. But did you love him?" Isabella was quiet for a long moment. "I thought I might learn to love him. And perhaps for a brief time. I thought he might learn to love me too. What happened? Life happened. Duty happened. We became so focused on being good rulers that we forgot to be good to each other. Isabella reached over and took her daughter's hand. But, Margaret, my experience doesn't have to be yours. Times are changing, even for royalty. Perhaps there's a way to honor both duty and your heart. Margaret's eyes brightened with hope. You mean you would speak to father about Sir James? Isabella hesitated. The idea of approaching Edward about anything personal felt impossible. They hadn't had a real conversation in months. But, looking at her daughter's hopeful face, she felt something stir inside her that had been dormant for years, the fierce protectiveness of a mother who doesn't want her child to repeat her mistakes. I will consider it, she said carefully. But, Margaret, you must understand that royal marriages involve considerations beyond personal preference. The kingdom's welfare, political alliances, financial stability, all these factors matter. I know. But, surely father's own happiness should matter too? And yours? Isabella felt tears prick at her eyes. When had her youngest daughter become so wise? What makes you think we're unhappy? Margaret gave her mother a look that was surprisingly mature. You live in the same castle but exist in different worlds. You speak to each other at formal events, but never really talk. At dinner, you both look so lonely, even sitting right next to each other. The observation was so accurate it took Isabella's breath away. Out of the mouths of babes, she thought. Even their 17-year-old daughter could see what they had been trying to hide from themselves and each other. Margaret, promise me something, Isabella said suddenly. What? Promise me that whatever happens with your marriage, you won't let duty completely eclipse your humanity. Don't become so focused on being a perfect princess that you forget to be a real person. Margaret squeezed her mother's hand. Only if you promise me the same thing. Isabella looked at her daughter with newfound respect. When did you become so clever? I had a good teacher, Margaret smiled, even if she doesn't always follow her own advice. After Margaret left, Isabella remained by her window, looking across at the light in Edward's chambers. For the first time in years, she found herself wondering what he was thinking, what kept him awake at night, whether he ever looked toward her window, and wondered the same thing about her. The castle settled into its nighttime quiet, filled with the small sounds of a building that had stood for centuries, creaking timbers, settling stones, the whisper of wind through ancient corridors. Isabella remained at her window until Edward's light finally went out, leaving both wings of the castle in darkness. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of the royal breakfast room as Edward sat alone at the vast mahogany table, picking at his eggs and reading dispatches from the kingdom's northern provinces. The same table that had once been filled with family chatter now felt enormous and empty, emphasizing the solitude that had become his constant companion. Isabella entered quietly, her morning dress a soft shade of lavender that complemented her still striking features. She moved with the controlled grace of someone who had spent decades in the public eye, every gesture measured and appropriate. Edward looked up briefly, nodded a polite good morning, and returned to his correspondence. Edward, Isabella said, her voice carrying a note of determination that made him glance up again. We need to discuss Margaret. He set down his papers and studied his wife's face. It had been so long since she had initiated a serious conversation with him that he felt momentarily disoriented. What about Margaret? She's in love with Sir James Worthington. Edward's jaw tightened. She's a child with a childish infatuation. The French Duke's proposal is advantageous for the kingdom. The matter is settled. Is it? Isabella sat down across from him, something she hadn't done at breakfast in over a year. Have you considered what we're asking of her? To marry a man she's never met, to live in a foreign country, to spend her life with someone who might treat her as nothing more than a political asset? Edward felt a familiar irritation rising in his chest. Isabella, you of all people should understand the necessities of royal marriage. We don't have the luxury of marrying for romantic fancy, don't we? The words hung in the air between them, loaded with years of unspoken resentment and regret. Edward stared at his wife, seeing something in her eyes he hadn't seen in years. Fire, passion, the spirit that had once attracted him to her despite their arranged circumstances. What exactly are you suggesting? Isabella leaned forward slightly, her composure cracking just enough to reveal the woman beneath the queen. I'm suggesting that perhaps our own marriage should serve as a cautionary tale rather than a model to replicate. The directness of her statement hit him like a physical blow. For years they had maintained the polite fiction that their marriage was successful, that they were content partners in ruling the kingdom. Neither had ever acknowledged aloud the hollowness that had grown between them. Our marriage has been perfectly adequate, Edward said stiffly. But, even as he spoke the words, he heard how empty they sounded. Adequate. Isabella repeated the word as if it tasted bitter. Yes, I suppose that's what we've achieved. An adequate marriage. Adequate happiness. An adequately hollow existence. Edward felt his chest tighten, whether from emotion or his failing heart, he couldn't tell. Isabella, what do you want from me? We've built a stable kingdom, raised 3 children, maintained peace with our neighbors. These are not small accomplishments. I want our daughter to have what we never did, Isabella said, her voice growing stronger. I want her to wake up next to someone who genuinely cares about her thoughts and feelings. I want her to have conversations that matter, to feel valued for who she is rather than what she represents. The words cut deeper than Isabella probably intended. Edward realized that she was describing not just what she wanted for Margaret, but what she had once wanted for herself. What they might have had if they had tried harder, fought more for each other instead of simply accepting their fate. And you think this young knight can provide that? Edward asked, his voice quieter now. I think she deserves the chance to find out. She's intelligent, Edward. She speaks 3 languages fluently. She understands politics and diplomacy. She could be an asset to any marriage. But shouldn't she also be happy? Edward stood and walked to the window, his back to Isabella. Outside, he could see Sir James training with the other knights in the courtyard. He was a good young man, honorable, skilled, from a respectable family. Not wealthy, not particularly connected politically, but decent. Under different circumstances, he might have been a reasonable choice for a minor noble's daughter. But Margaret wasn't a minor noble's daughter. She was a princess of Eldoria, and her marriage would affect trade agreements, military alliances, the balance of power across 3 kingdoms. How could he explain to Isabella that personal happiness was a luxury they couldn't afford? The French duke's offer includes a significant dowry and a trade agreement that would benefit our merchants for generations, Edward said without turning around. And is that worth our daughter's lifetime of unhappiness? Edward turned back to face his wife, and, for a moment, they looked at each other without the usual masks of formal courtesy. Was our marriage worth your lifetime of unhappiness? The question surprised them both. Isabella's breath caught, and Edward immediately regretted his honesty. But, now that the words were spoken, they couldn't be taken back. I don't know, Isabella said softly. Some days I think about the girl I was at 17, full of hopes and dreams and possibilities. And I wonder who she might have become if she had been allowed to choose her own path. And other days? Isabella was quiet for a long moment. Other days I look at our children and think that perhaps some good has come from our sacrifice. William is a fine young man who will be a good king. Catherine seems happy in her marriage. And Margaret? She paused, studying Edward's face. Margaret still has a chance to be both a good princess and a happy woman. Edward felt a pain in his chest that had nothing to do with his failing heart. Here was the woman he had lived with for 30 years, finally, speaking honestly about their life together, and all he could think about was how little time they had left. If he told her about his condition now, would it change anything? Would she see it as manipulation, an attempt to win the argument through pity? Isabella, he began, then stopped. How could he explain that Margaret's marriage felt urgent to him because he needed to know she was settled and secure before he died? How could he tell his wife that he was running out of time to fix the things that had gone wrong between them? There's something else, Isabella continued, seeming not to notice his hesitation. Margaret asked me yesterday if I had ever been in love with you. Edward felt as if the air had been knocked from his lungs. What did you tell her? I told her the truth, that I had hoped to learn to love you, and that I thought you might learn to love me too. They stood looking at each other across the breakfast table, 30 years of marriage and misunderstanding stretching between them like a vast ocean. Edward realized that this might be the most honest conversation they had ever had, and it was happening because their daughter's future hung in the balance. Isabella, he said quietly, do you think it's too late for people to change? To become something more than they've been? Something shifted in her expression, a flicker of the young woman she had once been. I don't know, Edward, but perhaps it's worth finding out. Before either of them could say more, a servant entered to announce that the French ambassador had arrived for his scheduled meeting about the marriage negotiations. Edward straightened his shoulders, slipping back into his royal role like putting on armor. We'll continue this conversation later, he said formally. Isabella nodded and rose to leave, but at the door she turned back. Edward, whatever we decide about Margaret, don't let her become like us. Don't let her spend 30 years wondering what might have been. As the door closed behind her, Edward sank back into his chair, his chest tight with pain and possibility. For the first time in years, he had seen glimpses of the woman he had married, intelligent, passionate, capable of challenging him. And, for the first time in years, he wondered if it might not be too late to find his way back to her. Even with death approaching 2 days after his conversation with Isabella, Edward sat in his study reviewing the French marriage contract when a sharp pain seized his chest like an iron fist. The quill fell from his hand as he gripped the edge of his desk, gasping for air that seemed to have turned to thick honey. The room spun around him, and dark spots danced at the edges of his vision. This was worse than before. Much worse. "Thomas," he managed to call out, though his voice came as barely a whisper. By the time his valet reached him, Edward had collapsed in his chair, his face gray and his breathing shallow. Thomas took one look at his master and ran for the royal physician, leaving Edward alone with the terrible knowledge that his time was running shorter than anyone had predicted. Dr. Harrison arrived within minutes, his black bag in hand, and his expression grave. After examining Edward's erratic pulse and listening to his labored breathing, the physician's face confirmed what Edward already knew. "Your Majesty, we need to discuss your condition with the Queen immediately. These episodes are becoming more frequent and more severe." Edward shook his head weakly. "Not yet. Give me a few more days to handle Margaret's situation first. With respect, Your Majesty, you may not have a few more days. Your heart is failing rapidly. The Queen must be informed, and preparations must be made for the succession." The word succession hung in the air like a death sentence. Edward thought of William, still away with his regiment near the Scottish border. Would there be time to summon him home? Would Edward live long enough to see his son take the throne, to ensure a smooth transition of power? "If something happens to me before we can arrange things properly," Edward said, his voice growing stronger with determination, "promise me you'll tell Isabella that I tried to love her, that I never stopped trying, even when it seemed impossible." Dr. Harrison studied his patient with compassionate eyes. "Perhaps you should tell her that yourself, Your Majesty." After the physician left, Edward remained in his chair, staring out the window at the gardens Isabella loved so much. The autumn flowers were beginning to fade, but she still tended them with careful attention, as if her devotion could hold back the inevitable winter. A commotion in the courtyard below caught his attention. Sir James Worthington was helping Margaret from her horse after what appeared to be a morning ride. Even from his window, Edward could see the young man's tender care for his daughter, the way he steadied her dismount and made sure she was safely on the ground before seeing to his own horse. Margaret's face was bright with happiness, and she lingered beside the young knight, clearly reluctant to go inside and return to the formal constraints of royal life. Edward thought about his conversation with Isabella, about the question of whether people could change, whether it was too late to become something more than they had been. Looking at his daughter's joy, he realized that perhaps change wasn't just possible, perhaps it was necessary. That evening, Edward asked Thomas to arrange a private dinner with Isabella in the small dining room adjacent to the royal chambers. It was an unusual request. They hadn't shared a meal alone in months, and Thomas raised an eyebrow in surprise. "Just the two of us, Your Majesty?" "Yes." "And Thomas?" "Asked cook to prepare the roasted duck with rosemary." It was always the Queen's favorite. Isabella arrived at 7 o'clock wearing the blue silk dress Edward had given her, though he suspected the choice was coincidental rather than sentimental. She looked puzzled by the intimate setting. Candles instead of the usual bright chandeliers, a small round table instead of the formal dining setup they typically used for state dinners. "This is unexpected," she said, taking the chair Edward held for her. "I wanted to continue our conversation about Margaret," he said, though that wasn't entirely true. He wanted something much more complicated, to find a way back to the woman he had married, to bridge 30 years of growing distance before it was too late. They ate in relative silence at first, but it was different from their usual cold formality. There was an expectancy in the air, as if both were waiting for something important to happen. "I've been thinking about what you said," Edward began as Thomas cleared away their plates. "About Margaret deserving a chance at happiness." Isabella looked up, hope flickering in her dark eyes. "And I've also been thinking about what she asked you, whether we had ever been in love." Isabella set down her wine glass carefully. "Edward, what are you trying to say?" "I'm trying to say that I think I failed you. Not just as a husband, but as a person who was supposed to care about your happiness." The words came easier than he had expected, as if they had been waiting 30 years to be spoken. Isabella's breath caught. "Edward, when we were young, I thought that respect and duty would be enough. That if we both fulfilled our roles properly, contentment would follow naturally. But I was wrong, wasn't I? Duty without affection is just survival. Isabella stared at him as if seeing a stranger. Why are you telling me this now? Edward felt another twinge in his chest and wondered if his heart would hold out long enough for this conversation. Because our daughter is 17 and in love, and she's asking us whether duty is worth a lifetime of emptiness. And I realize I don't want to tell her yes. You're willing to consider Sir James as a potential match? Edward nodded slowly. I'm willing to consider that maybe there are more important things than political advantage. That maybe, he paused, gathering courage, maybe we can teach Margaret something about love by example, even if we're learning it ourselves rather late. Isabella's eyes filled with tears. Edward, are you saying? I'm saying that if it's not too late, I would like to try to become the husband you deserved 30 years ago. I know I can't undo all the years of polite distance and missed opportunities. But, if you're willing, I'd like to try to find out who we might be to each other if we stopped hiding behind our crowns. Isabella was quiet for so long that Edward wondered if he had made a terrible mistake. Perhaps she had moved beyond any possibility of caring for him. Perhaps the damage was too deep to repair. Finally, she spoke. I used to imagine what it would be like if you ever said something like this to me. I used to rehearse what I would say in return. And what did you rehearse? That it was too late. That too much time had passed, too much hurt had accumulated. She looked directly into his eyes. But, sitting here now, I find that's not what I want to say at all. Edward felt something loosen in his chest, not the painful tightness of his failing heart, but the knot of loneliness and regret he had carried for so many years. What do you want to say? He asked softly. I want to say that I'm tired of being alone while married. I'm tired of sleeping in the same castle as someone I care about, but never really talking to him. I'm tired of watching our daughter's happiness and wondering why we never fought harder for our own. Isabella reached across the small table and placed her hand over his. The simple touch sent warmth through Edward's entire body, the first genuine physical affection they had shared in years. So what do we do now? She asked. Edward turned his hand palm up and intertwined their fingers. I suppose we start over. We learn to be Edward and Isabella instead of just the king and queen. For the first time in years, Isabella smiled at him with something that looked like real joy. I'd like that very much. As they sat in the candlelight, holding hands like the young people they had once been, Edward felt a bittersweet ache in his chest. They had found each other again just as time was running out. But, perhaps, he thought, even a brief second chance was better than no chance at all. The following weeks brought an unexpected warmth to Ravenshollow Castle. Edward and Isabella began taking morning walks together in the gardens, their conversations tentative at first but growing deeper as they rediscovered each other. Isabella would ask about his thoughts on kingdom matters, and Edward found himself seeking her counsel on decisions he had been making alone for years. They dined together most evenings, and sometimes Edward would find Isabella reading in his study while he worked, just as she had in their early years. Margaret noticed the change immediately, her eyes bright with hope as she watched her parents actually talking to each other instead of merely exchanging polite formalities. When Edward announced that he would postpone the French marriage negotiations to explore other options, Margaret threw her arms around him with a joy that made his chest ache, though he couldn't tell anymore if the ache was emotional or physical. Isabella had begun looking at him differently too. Sometimes he would catch her watching him with something that might have been affection, and she had started placing her hand on his arm when they walked together. Small gestures, but they felt monumental after so many years of careful distance. But Edward's body was failing faster than his heart was healing. The episodes were coming more frequently now, sharp pains that left him breathless and shaking. He had become expert at hiding them, excusing himself from meetings or meals when he felt the warning signs. But he knew Dr. Harrison was right. Isabella needed to know. The end came suddenly, as these things often do. Edward was in the rose garden with Isabella, discussing plans for Margaret's 18th birthday celebration next month, when the world tilted sideways. He tried to grip the stone bench beside him, but his hand wouldn't obey. The familiar tightness in his chest had returned with devastating force, and this time he knew there would be no recovery. Edward. Isabella's voice seemed to come from very far away, though she was kneeling right beside him as he collapsed onto the garden path. Her hands were on his face, and he could see panic in her eyes, but the sound was fading, as if he were sinking underwater. Dr. Harrison arrived quickly, but one look at Edward's gray complexion and labored breathing told the story. There was nothing more to be done. Isabella sent the servants away and knelt beside her husband in the autumn garden, surrounded by the roses she had tended for 30 years. "How long?" she whispered to the physician. "Minutes, perhaps an hour if we're fortunate," Dr. Harrison replied gently. "I'll give you privacy." When they were alone, Isabella took Edward's hand in both of hers. His breathing was shallow and irregular, but his eyes were still clear, still focused on her face. "You knew, didn't you?" she asked softly. "About your heart. You've known for a while." Edward managed a small nod. Speaking was becoming difficult, but there were things that needed to be said while he still could. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Didn't want pity," he whispered. "Wanted you to choose me, not duty." Isabella's eyes filled with tears. "Oh, Edward, you foolish man. I did choose you. These past weeks, I chose you every day." He squeezed her hand with what little strength remained. "Isabella, I need to tell you. Save your strength, my love." "No. Important." Each word was an effort now, but he had to make her understand. "Loved you. Always loved you, just didn't know how to show it." Isabella bent closer, her tears falling onto his face. "I know. I loved you too. Differently than I expected, more quietly than I hoped for. But I loved you." Edward felt a profound relief wash over him. They had found each other again, even if only for these few precious weeks. It wasn't the 30 years of happiness they might have had, but it was real, and it was theirs. "Margaret," he breathed. "She'll be happy. She'll choose love, and we'll honor that choice. Both of us." Edward smiled, the expression transforming his face despite his pain. "Good. Don't let her make our mistakes." "Never." Isabella smoothed his hair back from his forehead, a gesture she hadn't made in decades. "Edward, I need you to know something. These past weeks, seeing who you really are beneath the crown, I would choose you again. If I could do it all over, knowing how it would end, I would still choose you." The words wrapped around Edward's failing heart like a blessing. He had spent so many years wondering if Isabella regretted their marriage, if she looked back on her lost possibilities with bitterness. To know that she would choose him again, that their love, imperfect and late-blooming as it was, had been real enough to make the pain worthwhile, was more than he had dared to hope. "Thank you," he whispered, and the words carried the weight of 30 years of gratitude for her patience, her grace, her willingness to try again when it would have been easier to remain distant. The afternoon sun slanted through the bare tree branches, casting gentle patterns of light and shadow across the garden. Isabella could feel Edward's life ebbing away like the tide, slow but inexorable. She held his hand and spoke softly about their children, about the spring flowers that would bloom after winter, about the kingdom they had built together despite their personal struggles. "Isabella," Edward whispered, his voice now barely audible. She leaned close, her ear almost touching his lips. "I love you," he breathed. "I love you. And I'm sorry we waited so long to find each other." Isabella closed her eyes, feeling his words settle into the deepest parts of her heart. "I love you too, Edward. I love you. And I forgive you. And I forgive myself. Rest now." Edward's eyes remained fixed on her face as his breathing grew shallower. With tremendous effort, he lifted their joined hands to his lips and pressed the gentlest kiss to her fingers. "My queen," he whispered. "My Isabella." And then, he was gone, his eyes still open but no longer seeing, his hand still warm in hers but no longer holding on. Isabella sat with him as the autumn afternoon faded into evening, holding the hand of the man she had shared 30 years with but had only truly known for 3 weeks. The roses around them released their final fragrances into the cooling air, and the castle bells began to toll, announcing to the kingdom that their king had found his final peace. When the servants finally came to find her, Isabella rose from the garden path with dignity, her grief private but her resolve clear. Edward was gone, but he had left her with the gift of knowing that love, even imperfect love that came too late, was better than no love at all. She would carry that knowledge forward as she guided their daughter toward a different kind of marriage, one built on affection as well as duty. And sometimes, in quiet moments, she would remember a dying king who had whispered his love in a rose garden, and a queen who had finally learned to listen. Margaret found her mother there an hour later, standing among the roses with tears on her cheeks, but strength in her posture. "He loved you, didn't he?" Margaret asked softly. Isabella looked at her daughter, young, hopeful, still believing in the possibility of fairy tale endings. "Yes," she said simply. "He loved me, and I loved him." It took us far too long to say it, but, in the end, it was real. Margaret slipped her arm through her mother's as they walked back toward the castle together. I'm sorry you had to wait so long to find each other. So am I, Isabella replied. But perhaps our story isn't about the time we lost. Perhaps it's about the love we finally found, even at the end. And perhaps that's enough. The castle doors closed behind them as evening settled over Eldoria, and somewhere in the kingdom, a young knight waited to hear if love would triumph over duty, not knowing that it already had.